And now let me introduce our speaker for the day, Leo Panitch.
I'm very, very glad to be here, Cliff. I especially appreciate the invitation because, as you know, in the middle of February, I attended a panel discussion that you were part of, sponsored by the Center for Global Justice in the Biblioteca Publica in San Miguel de Allende, where you guys are located. And although I had known many, many fellow travelers, both Americans and Canadians who had been going to San Miguel every year in the winter months and telling me what a remarkable collection of lefties, intellectual and cultural, were to be found there. My wife and I went there for the first time in February. And who did I discover? I discovered you, who I had met through the Radical Philosophy Association in a trip that you sponsored for a bunch of us to go to Cuba. Liz Maestras, my dear friend from the Breath Forum and Marxist Institute in New York, Gregory Demont, and a whole host of others. And I realized that you are a continuation of the romance that the North American left, especially the American left, has had with the Mexican Revolution since the beginning, since the early part of the 20th century. Of course, that was most solidified in art with the links that were created between the muralists of the type that I have to say, the walls where I attended that lecture back in February were covered in the most remarkable political murals. And I was in New York in early March, just before everything was shut down, and attended at MoMA, a remarkable exhibit on the link between the muralists and the American left in the 1920s and 1930s. Fascinating. So that's by a long way of an introduction of saying, I never would have imagined that I'd be giving a talk to the Center for Global Justice so soon, unless I came back to San Miguel. And now the pandemic has created a situation in which I can do this through this medium in cyberspace. Of course, when I went there in February, one was aware that there was a very dangerous virus that had global dimensions. But I think the left needs to own this. It wasn't only capitalist states that were blithely ignoring what did happen by March. It was also well-educated people like ourselves. I remember going to and coming back on the airplane from Toronto to Mexico City, and no one was thinking about the pandemic, even though by that point, there were already a number of cases in North America. So there we have it. The pandemic was on the march in February, and not only were capitalist governments ignoring it, we on the left, I think, were thinking ourselves invincible in the face of it. The title I chose for this talk, Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic, was deliberately chosen so that it would apply as much to the pandemic of 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic at the end of World War I, as it could apply to today. A speech could have been given, I'm sure speeches were given, called Capitalism, Socialism, and the Pandemic in 1918, 1919. It was known as the Spanish flu, and somewhat similar today, that was a misnomer, just as Trump was trying to name the current coronavirus the Chinese virus. In fact, that virus was begun in Kansas in the United States on a pig farm, and it was American soldiers sent to World War I and turning the tide in terms of the outcome of World War I, who carried it to Europe. And then after the war, they brought it back. And that was crucial to the second wave. What's, I think, important about, and why I wanted the title of the talk to reflect both pandemics, was that we are hearing today, as when heard then from the left, the phrase commonly intoned, socialism or barbarism. This was a phrase that Rosa Luxemburg, in her Junius pamphlet in 1916 during World War I, had made very famous, although it was by no means new. As she said in discussing it, a generation earlier, Engels had used the phrase, saying, capitalist society stands at a crossroads, either a transition to socialism or a regression to barbarism. She cited Engels, but in fact it was Kautsky who in 1892 actually said that. Engels probably repeated it in a speech, a very chilling speech he made in 1896, predicting very astonishingly the slaughter of inter-imperial wars that were likely to come in the early 20th century. But the phrase became associated with Luxemburg. And it became associated, of course, with barbarism in the form it took, with the inter-imperial conflicts. After the globalization and the dynamism of capitalism in, the early 20th century, the great second industrial revolution, that war brought people to the attention that if you weren't able to get out of capitalism, there would be a regression to barbarism. And one's hearing that again today in the context of this pandemic, in the context of the inability of capitalist states to prepare for it, to contain it properly, by virtue of the way in which so much of the public healthcare industry in contemporary capitalism has been demeaned through austerity, and the way even in those countries which do have universal Medicare, increasingly have it in a way that is bound up with private capital accumulation and the firms that provide healthcare, even to the public sector. So the parallels in that respect are important, I think, to bear in mind, especially at a moment when you could say for the first time since the 1910s, the word socialism has some good odor in the American public discourse. And then there's some other uncanny parallels. That conjuncture was marked by the assertion of American isolationism in the wake of World War I. We all know that Woodrow Wilson's attempt to get the United States to sign on to the League of Nations was defeated in the American Senate. And mixed up with that isolationism, which if you go back and read some of the speeches sound a lot like Trump, was an anti-immigration sentiment, which led by 1924 to the closure of American borders, to the great migration that had taken place to the United States, not least from Europe, from the 1870s, one could even say, when it came to Germans and the Irish, from the 1840s and 1850s onwards. So there are parallels that are very interesting. And then there's another parallel, that great second industrial revolution, which produced, of course, great breakthroughs in medicine, in drugs, as well as the impact that public sanitation services, which were finally introduced in urban areas, by the beginning of the 20th century we're having, was not able to prevent the Great Flu at the end of World War I. People had to face soberly and coldly the fact that capitalist development, dynamic capitalist development, did not mean that the way in which nature always bit back humankind for the way it came to dominate nature, which was through plagues very often, that this could happen in capitalist industrialized societies, and even with an industrialized medical system. And we're seeing that today in the wake of the fourth great industrial revolution, the technological revolution, the information digital revolution as well. So there are parallels in that respect that are worth, I think, thinking about. The isolationism in that conjuncture, which came from a United States which was just asserting its primacy in 20th century capitalism, was just beginning to prove in the first decades of the 20th century that the 20th century belonged to the United States. It was the American century. The isolationism was reflected in the United States not joining the League of Nations, in the closure to migration, but it was negated by the dynamism of American capitalism through the 1920s. The carve up of the old empires, the old European empires, was crucial to the American placement in the Middle East, along with the British, in terms of the extraction of oil for the fossil fuel industry, which was so important to industrialization. The United States was crucially involved in that moment, in the carve up of the modern day Middle East. Secondly, the multinational corporations jumped over that isolationist policy. General Motors and Ford were setting up car assembly plants, not only in Canada, but in Europe through the 1920s. What was not so much the case as the way in which Trump's isolationism is countered and negated today was the limited capacity of the American state to take any responsibility for managing an international capitalism. The Fed had only been created in 1912. The American dollar was already beginning to replace the pound sterling as the global currency. And indeed, the reparations put upon the Germans for losing the war, which involved paying reparations to France and the United Kingdom, was really a matter of paying the London and Paris, and having them, by virtue of their debts to the United States, having borrowed so heavily to prosecute the war in dollars, shoveling that money back to New York. And one of the reasons that the 1920s produced the type of instability was that the Americans played a role in the 1920s, which helped to bring the world back to the gold standard, didn't manage the financialization that led to. And when the Great Depression came out of that financial instability, the Federal Reserve didn't have a clue to how to contain it. In today's conjuncture, it is the Federal Reserve alone amongst the American state apparatuses which has proved its competence in the current pandemic and the economic crisis that it has produced. The Fed has acted as the world central bank. Not only is the American central bank in underwriting the American stock market, buying municipal debt for the first time in its history, buying junk bonds so the bond market wouldn't collapse, but lending indeed to small businesses, financing the American state's asset purchases of the largest trucking company in the United States. Practically, even no one has ever noticed this. In the same way the Treasury did that during the 2008-9 crisis when they bought a portion of General Motors. But what the Fed above all has done, which it did not at all do in the early part of the century after, in the conjuncture of the previous pandemic, was act as the world central bank, pouring dollars around the world through swaps to other central banks so that their financial markets would not be bereft of dollars, which is the global currency, and their financial systems would seize up. They expanded the swap lines that were used in 2008, 2007, 2008, to 9 other countries, including Mexico. And by virtue of that, have put some $5 trillion into the global economic system that has kept the financial system going, the capitalist financial system going. It's been extremely active. And unlike 2007-8, when it was hiding what it was doing in this respect, thinking that not only Republicans, but even Democrats would attack the Fed for lending dollars abroad in the middle of the crisis, the Fed has been very open about doing this. So there's a major contrast between what the American state was at the time of the pandemic in that conjuncture after World War I, 100 years ago, and what it is today. I want to come back to what the American state is today and how demeaned it is, apart from its capacity to be a firefighter in the face of financial crises. But first, I want to draw another parallel, and that is to bring up the question of socialism, the other side of socialism and barbarism. Of course, the Russian Revolution shares a date with the flu epidemic, 1918. But even apart from the promise of the Russian Revolution, the hopes that it generated, etc., one needs to remember the flowering of socialist movements and discourse and media in the United States in the decade of 1910. Debs running for president in 1912, the Appeal to Reason being the largest socialist newspaper in the United States with 500,000 subscribers, socialist mayors being elected in tiny little cowboy towns across the American West, right? And it wasn't only a matter in that moment, in that conjuncture of the Russian Revolution. The utterly parliamentarist British Labour Party, which had not been admitted to the Second International because it had never accepted the thesis of class struggle being at the core of transformative social change. It had always been premised on, we will bring the ruling class and the working class together in harmony. Right? In 1918, even the British Labour Party adopted its famous Clause 4, committing itself to the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and their democratic administration. So that pandemic was a moment in which to say socialism or barbarism provided, it seemed, a real alternative to capitalism. Right? And we see today, despite the fact that we now can look back and see that not without the role of the American state, the promise of the American Revolution, the promise of the Mexican Revolution was undermined. Right? We can see that despite commitments on the part of social democracy to socialist goals and values, those parties became increasingly integrated within the framework of a global capitalism through the course of the 20th century. We see that despite all of that, despite the collapse of communism after its denouement in a stagnating Stalinism by the 1960s and 70s and 80s, despite the loss of any commitment to socialism on the part of social democratic parties, all of who embraced Clinton's third way and took the American Democratic Party under Clinton's neoliberalism as their model, we see a revival of socialist promise and socialist discourse of all places in the heart of the empire over the course of the last years. And I'm not just speaking of Sanders' candidacy. I'm not only speaking of Our Revolution, which is of course his campaign organization. Although I don't think one should denigrate the way in which Sanders uses revolution, identifying a ruling class, identifying how it undermines democracy, insisting on the universalization of social programs, and above all, describing himself as the organizer in chief, should he be president, the image of the socialist cadre as the organizer. Right? One shouldn't denigrate that use of revolution, it seems to me, however modest, if you like, Sanders' proposals in fact are in revolutionary terms. But beyond that, one sees a flowering of socialist media in, of all places, the heart of the empire, with Jacobin having 50,000 subscribers and 2 million hits to its website a month. Now, whatever one wants to make of opinion polls that show a majority of Americans under 35 more positively disposed to socialism than capitalism, since one wants to say to them, what do you mean by socialism? Nevertheless, this does seem to me to give a concreteness, a possibility to the phrase socialism and barbarism. A century after Rosa Luxemburg resurrected the term from the 1890s, that it hasn't had for a very, very long time. Now, one has to say that socialism did not replace capitalism, not only because of repression, not only because of the encirclement of the Russian Revolution, the extent to which that was a key factor in introducing the dictatorship in the Soviet Union, not only in the repression of socialist movements, not least in the United States, through the course of the 20th century. It also had to do with the dynamism of capitalism, especially after the Great Depression, some of which could be already seen in the 1920s, interrupted by the second great crisis of capitalism, and then brought back to life through the stimulus of the war economy as well as the New Deal, and through the post-war period, a massification of capitalist commodification and finance and credit, as well as a expansion of capitalist production both in capacities, both in goods and services, which did have the effect of integrating working classes in the advanced capitalist world into the capitalist economy in a way that would have been unimaginable to even the most sober Marxist critics at the time of the 1918-1919 pandemic. You could still argue then that Marx's prediction that with capitalist development would come proletarian immiseration was being proved visibly. Through the course of the 20th century, you could only hold on to that notion by saying that immiseration was relative in the advanced capitalist countries, because there was no question that the mass of the working class, that its standard of living was indeed increased. In good part, of course, through its own efforts in organizing the labor movement, through its political pressures within liberal democracies, right? But accessing thereby the enormous riches of capitalist commodities, sometimes through the welfare payments they received, more often through the collective bargaining gains, which in the American case, moreover, in the post-war period, when the rest of the advanced capitalist world opted for socialized universal Medicare, which was seeded, by the way, in what was the realization of the public health consequences of the pandemic of 1919. In the American case, the labor movement was able to obviate the winning of that by securing a medical insurance through collective bargaining, privatizing, if you like, healthcare through its collective bargaining strength. The result of that being that the United States has been left without a public Medicare system, the irrationality of which is exposed more than ever in the face of this pandemic. But the limits of a labor movement, which recruits members by promising them health insurance, private health insurance, right, was seen in the fact that the labor unions were not supporting Sanders in his demand for universal Medicare because it would reduce their capacity to hold on to members, right, or to get new ones. So I think one does have to recognize that the fact that socialism versus barbarism did not seem much of an option for much of the century after the 1919 pandemic did have to do with the dynamism and integrative capacity of advanced capitalism. And insofar as that wasn't the case in what used to be known as the third world, the developing world, it nevertheless was the case that for the most part, what they aspired to was getting out of the underdevelopment that prevented industrialization in their countries and getting on the capitalist commodification treadmill that was denied them by the reproduction of imperialism and colonialism, even with decolonization after World War II. Okay, that's the parallel I wanted to make, and I hope people find it somewhat interesting. But where does it really leave us in terms of the prospects for socialism today? I am not at all depressed about this by virtue of Sanders' defeat. I don't think that the energy in any sense has been diminished by that in any substantive way. And I think indeed you see the continuing energy of it in the extent to which the Black Lives Matter protests, these remarkable, this wave of protests that have taken place during the course of this pandemic in the face of police brutalization of the Black population. The fact that these protests are so heavily integrated racially is, I think, unlike the protests of the 1960s, except in the early 60s around the Civil Rights Act, but the massive protests, riots from 1964-5 on in almost all cities in the United States were not integrated ones. These are, and I think it has much to do with the shift to the left that has taken place, embracing a conception of socialism once again in the United States. Moreover, for all of the talk of American decline, for all of the talk of the United States no longer being at the center of the capitalist universe. It is nevertheless fascinating that that outbreak of political protest in the United States over what has always been the Achilles heel of American democracy, that is racism and the caste system that balkanizes the American working class. America remains enough in the public eye that it kicks off demonstrations right around the world of this kind of political nature. I think it was already the case with the anti-globalization movements, if you want to start with Seattle in 1999, that the irrationality of a global capitalism was becoming more and more visible to more and more young people. At that time, the disappointments with social democratic parties, with the communist parties, gave a strong anarchist tinge to those protests, a strong anti-party tinge, a admiration for the Zapatistas in Mexico articulated in terms of changing the world without taking power. But it was discovered through the course of those protests, coming to a climax with Occupy in 2011, that you can protest forever and protest till hell freezes over and you won't change the world. And there was a remarkable turn in the wake of that, back to politics, of which the Sanders phenomenon was one element. Podemos, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain were other exemplars of it. And the fact that you've had a mobilizing political campaign explicitly defining itself as democratic socialist, which has centered on the irrationality of capitalist states in terms of growing inequality and growing lack of access to public health, seems to me to bode extremely well for the continuing viability of this socialist discourse and this socialist energy that we've seen, despite the defeats of Corbyn and Syriza and Sanders. What reinforces this is that the economic crisis of 2008, followed by the politics of austerity, which was installed everywhere after the stimulus that capitalist states engaged in, both monetary and fiscal, in order to prevent it turning into another Great Depression. The bringing financial markets back to their health reinforced their power to discipline states to not spend money on social expenditure so that they could pay off their debts to the financial system. What has happened by virtue of that development is that the economic crisis morphed into a political crisis. And that is what Trump represents. He represents not a continuation of the economic crisis so much, but a turning of that economic crisis into a political crisis, in which the illegitimacy of capitalist globalization in people's eyes on the left and as well as on the right has been a central factor. Unlike those who champion globalization in the 1980s and 90s and said it was a matter of states no longer being able to control capital and therefore needing to get on board with transnational capital flows. In fact, states were never bypassed by capital. They made globalization. You don't get free trade agreements by multinational corporations signing them. States sign free trade agreements. It was the free trade agreement that was signed between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, NAFTA, that epitomized the free trade agreements that codified globalization around the world, opened up trade markets and capital flows to the extent that they did. So states remained very active in a globalized capitalism. They were authors of it, but they legitimated it to their populations in terms of it being in the national interest. And that was especially done in the United States. NAFTA was presented by Clinton, despite having indicated he wasn't keen on it during his election campaign, as in the American national interest. And what Trump picked up by 2016, and so did Sanders, was the continuous failure of the Democratic Party to be able to demonstrate to so many American workers, as was also obvious to so many Mexican workers, that this was hardly in the national interest, insofar as one looked to what that did for the working classes in those countries. So globalization, by virtue of this contradiction between the legitimation of a political system still being based on nation-state identifications and a economic system that is increasingly oriented transnationally, that contradiction produces the kind of political crisis that Trump represents. In his case, of course, it is combined with a right-wing populism that has barbaric connotations to it, inbuilt. Whereas in the case of the socialist critics of globalization, who also point to its lack of legitimacy in terms of democracy at a national level, are offering the alternative to those barbaric elements. What I've always been most concerned about, and I'll come to an end with this, since Trump's election, would be that there would be a punch-up between a Black Lives Matter demonstration and a local police force, with perhaps a police station being burnt by virtue of the police use of arms against demonstrators. And that insofar as local police forces and bicycle gangs form the base of Trump's political movement, that this would become the opportunity for a closure of democratic political space in the United States. I feared, after what happened in Minneapolis, after the demonstrations and riots that it produced, and after Trump was calling for the military to intervene, that we were seeing that script being written out. And that barbarism was going to be visited upon us in this pandemic situation via a Trump equivalency of the Napoleon Bonaparte dictatorship that Marx wrote about in the 18th Brumaire, which also, after, by the way, took place after a failed impeachment. I still fear that Trump will attempt to postpone the election, which will probably have to go to the Supreme Court. And of course, he'll do so in the most brazen way, given that he's made light of the pandemic, insofar as it is continuing in the fall, in the most brazen way, as he always does. He will say, well, we can't possibly have an election in these circumstances, and try to get the Supreme Court, since it's unclear who constitutionally is responsible for American elections. Is it Congress? Is it state level, et cetera? And if the Supreme Court were to endorse that postponement, I think it would make the riots that have taken place in recent weeks look like a Tea Party, and I don't mean the Boston Tea Party. Were he to run in the election and lose and refuse to resign on the grounds that postal balloting is necessarily fraudulent, right, that would produce an even greater wave of riots. And the question at that point would be whether Trump would be able to call in martial law and the army would accede to keeping him in power. I think we've had a foretaste of that, and the response of the generals, including of all people, Mad Dog Mattis, who was his defense secretary, and his chief of staff, Kelly, as well as a number of generals, saying they weren't going to be pulled into this, shows that there's still some life left in American democracy, even on the side of the forces of repression, the apparatuses of repression in the United States. Were Biden to win, he obviously doesn't represent the socialist wing of socialism or barbarism. What he would represent, it seems to me, is an attempt to rebuild some of the capacity of the American state that was already whittled away very heavily in the neoliberal era under Clinton and Obama, as well as the Bushes, but under Trump has been carried to an extreme. It's ironic that the one state agency that has shown its capacity in this pandemic is the Federal Reserve, which has the greatest autonomy from the American state apparatus. Independent central banks, which the left used to attack so much because they couldn't be given orders by democratically elected governments to run monetary policy the way they'd want. Well, the saving grace has been, and of course, mostly for the financiers, but also for the masses who are dependent on capitalist credit in order to be able to feed themselves and put a roof over their heads. Right? We have been dependent on what the Federal Reserve has done to keep this bloody system going. And it showed remarkable capacity to do that, planning capacity to be ready for it. In the case of the health system, what you see is the astonishing lack of capacity in the American state. Of course, we know Trump has run down the capacity of the Treasury and of the State Department, et cetera. But to see in report after report, in the context of the news about the pandemic, the way in which the Center for Disease Control was defunded, the way in which one agency for another dealing with pandemics under the auspices of National Security Council, not let alone the Department of Health and Human Resources, have been confused and diminished under this presidency. Only doubles the effect of neoliberalism, whereby so much of public health care, so much of pandemic preparation was set out to contracts to private firms. Whether that was masks, this was done under the Clinton, but especially under the Obama administration as well, whether it was masks or ventilators. Clinton had in fact put in a major order for ventilators to be met in the United States in 2011-12 from a Japanese firm and owned firm in California at $3,000 a ventilator. But that contract was never realized because that firm was taken over by a large medical instruments company. And they didn't want that firm competing with the ventilators they were producing at 20 times the price. So they broke the contract, didn't fulfill it. You see the irrationality of capitalism and the irrationality of the capitalist state in that one instance. But carried under the Trump administration to a level which is dumbfounding. The question will then be whether, given the pressure of this socialist enervation, which we've seen especially in the heart of the empire in recent years. A Biden victory, while in no sense socialist, would be open to a rebuilding of state capacity to introduce reforms which would give confidence again, not only to socialists, but to working class people, which would include the type of reforms to labor legislation, which would provide the basis for a class remobilization in fact, a new class formation in the United States, wherein the balkanization of the class in racial terms would begin to be overcome, as they have not been overcome under the framework of the old collective bargaining and labor relations legislation. Were that to be the case, then what Rosa argued, which is that there is no real opposition between reform and revolution. Reform is the means, revolution is the end, would come onto the agenda. And we'd have some hope after this pandemic is over for beginning to deal with the environmental crisis, which is, of course, what barbarism means today in terms of its challenge, much more than the threat of inter-imperial war, that we might be able to begin to address that once again. I'll stop with that.
To participate in the discussion, we have Gregory Diamant with us, and Betsy Bowman, and myself. We'll probably all have questions that we'll want to ask. I'd like to pose a question somewhat related to this question of production being shut down. Relating, the question basically comes off your book, Making of Global Capitalism. Since writing it, there's been, well, a couple of major transformations. For one, as you've referred to, the Trump administration has sought to weaken the state apparatus, as well as the multilateral institutions that support globalism, WTO, NATO, as well as existing trade agreements. But second, the pandemic has disrupted the global supply chains that tie economies together. Might you now have to add another chapter to your book titled maybe The Unmaking of Global Capitalism?
Yeah, well, that was always, of course, the implication of the book, although our message was that we would like the unmaking to be done by socialists rather than by a return to inter-imperial rivalry. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to the last chapter, we say a lot of that will depend on the Chinese working class.
Yeah.
Our argument was that the main contradictions in capitalism, in global capitalism, lie within states rather than between states. And while people have constantly, on the left, been constantly trying to resurrect Lenin's theory of imperialism by finding a return to inter-imperial rivalry, one empire will replace another or even lead to war, we were arguing that that was less likely than globalization being interrupted by domestic class struggles. And I think we've been borne out in that respect, especially in the United States, more than in China, although they certainly exist there. I mean, our question was, would the Chinese working class become integrated into consumerist, credit-driven capitalism the way the American working class, or at least large portions of it were, right? But it looks like we underestimated the extent to which divisions within the United States domestically, not always expressed by socialists by any means, would undermine America's leadership of globalization. And I think that is happening. That said, let's remember that Amazon, an American corporation, is keeping much of the world economy supply chains going. It's delivering goods and services, right? Not only inside the United States at a level that is unimaginable, right? But is doing so inside most countries in the world, right? And is growing phenomenally because of it. All the more case, of course, for it being made into a public utility. It's not the post office that should be shut down. Amazon should be taken over by the post office, and indeed organized. The workers in it unionized. We also see, and this is very significant with regard to Wall Street and China's integration into global capitalism. On April 1st, the Chinese implemented a provision for which they've been under pressure all the way back to Clinton, but especially under Trump, which was to open up their financial services industry to total foreign ownership, especially asset management. And Morgan Stanley on that day bought out, which had a minority stake in a Chinese asset management firm. Soon, on the very day that China introduced that provision, that you could have full foreign ownership of an asset management firm, Morgan Stanley spent $1 billion buying out their Chinese partner so they could have full ownership. And China has generally responded to the pressure by opening up its financial services system to foreign capital, which is what has been Wall Street's agenda since the 1990s. So there is global, you're right, Cliff, I think that the global supply chains have been badly hit. There's no question, and you see it in the amount of goods coming into Long Beach, the port in Los Angeles. You see it in terms of ships floating around the world's oceans, carrying goods that they can't offload because people don't know what to do with those supplies, even though they've ordered them, etc. No, this is a real crisis. Mm-hmm. And the irrationality, moreover, which was already clear in the context of the ecological crisis, of reliance on global supplies in the production of many essential products, has also been borne out, even in the production of masks, right? Let alone much more vital equipment, right? So ideologically as well, there's a visibility of the irrationality of the system, all of which makes it quite precarious, I agree. Nevertheless, the integration of capitalism, of capitalist firms, of multinational corporations is very real, much more so than it was in the 1920s, when that already negated the isolationism of the Republicans. Well, it's much, much deeper today. So that isolationism has a lot of material forces to contest against, although those material forces are full of contradictions of the kind you were pointing to. And we'll have to see where it goes.
Yeah, we're seeing how fragile the globalist project is, depending on global supply chains and just-in-time delivery. It doesn't take much to disrupt that, and of course, the pandemic has disrupted it massively. Yeah. For example, we came across this statistic that a firm like Volkswagen has 5,000 suppliers, and those are just the first tier suppliers, and each of those have maybe hundreds of suppliers as well. Now, it doesn't take much to break that system.
Yeah, no, but what does that mean? Does that mean the system collapses? Or does it mean that Volkswagen, and not only Volkswagen, American car companies, let alone tech companies, are extremely powerful capitalist forces, which will, unlike the German steel industrialists backing fascism by 1930-31, not to be prepared to support a right-wing isolationism. Sure, they want their tax breaks, and they got it, right? I think the price of all this is that they're going to have to pay a wealth tax, which is going to actually make them swallow very hard, assuming that this turns out the way we'd want to in November. It's an historic election. But it does show you that there are very powerful forces who depend on this system not collapsing, right? From Volkswagen to Amazon.
Get your questions
Zoom.
in. But now,
you.
let me ask Gregory, do you have any questions that you would like to pose?
I do. I have a question. It comes up of a point of irony. Both Sanders and Corbyn, in their campaigns and their political talk, have obviously proposed a lot of reforms, and the powers that be and the pundits have poo-pooed them as being not achievable financially. And the role of the state minimized. However, under this pandemic, with what has happened with the Federal Reserve, as Leo has mentioned, is that probably as much money or more has been put into the system than maybe Corbyn and Sanders have proposed. There's been money to support people. There's been money to support small businesses. England has done that as well. And my question would be is, how much of that is penetrating the consciousness of people in general? And how can that be used as a way of organizing, building reforms, leading ultimately to socialism? Because it was told to us before that it was impossible to do any of these things. And now we're seeing many things that can be done with the necessity to do them.
Yes, absolutely, Gregory. You see, when it comes to reproducing capitalism, as was also seen in wartime, in the Second World War, capitalist states will do things that capitalist politicians said were impossible, or that indeed capitalists didn't let them do, insofar as they had influence over those states. So yes, it's been, astonishing the extent to which not only the Fed's monetary policy, but fiscal expenditure has been undertaken at a level that goes far beyond what Corbyn or Sanders had the temerity to ask for. Far beyond. Remember the debates when they kept on costing how much it would cost to introduce Medicare? Well, the American Congress has won $3 trillion fiscal stimulus, right? And another $3 trillion fiscal stimulus on the cards, right?
Right.
Everybody during the British election campaign in 2019 kept repeating Margaret Thatcher's mantra, who will pay for it, including working class people in Yorkshire, in the industrial heartlands that were always the base of the Labour Party. And it shows you how far that type of thinking had penetrated. Well, the first thing Boris Johnson said, can't remember whether it was before he got the virus or after, was there is such a thing as society, when Thatcher's famously had said there is no such thing as society, right? It's a sociologist or socialist construct. There are only individuals and their families and markets, she said, right? So you see it ideologically and you see it in the policies. And that is one of the reasons that I was saying that I'm not dismayed by Sanders being defeated or Corbyn being defeated. On the contrary, I think in some respects, had they not been, it would be more difficult to build on what has been done in the name of saving capitalism, as well as saving people's lives, of course, in the face of this pandemic. It even goes to the point of, in the Corbyn Manifesto was a commitment to nationalize broadband on the internet so that it would be available to regions which did not have it, especially rural areas, but also to poor people which did not have it. And you see today, when schools have to rely on families having broadband in order for their kids to have any access to even public school education, how much sense it makes and how you could make a running on the basic internet services being provided as a public utility, not on the basis of who can pay for it and the expansion of those services so it reaches the whole population. So it ranges across a whole range of things, including in the United States, how difficult it will now be to deny the importance of universal health care, how difficult it will not be now be to deny that the elderly have been warehoused in the most appalling facilities run for profit across the United States, including in the most wealthy parts of the United States, and the tech giants, those capitalists who are burgeoning today. This has been reinforced ideologically by the establishment media for the most part. Not Fox News, but look at the New York Times. The New York Times series of editorials on what is now required to restore sanity to the American polity is far to the left of the programs of most European social democratic parties. In my own country, in Canada, our national newspaper, the equivalent New York Times, is the Toronto Globe and Mail, a right-wing newspaper for the most part, an establishment right-wing newspaper. Suddenly, out of the blue, it comes out in favor of extending Canada's Medicare system to pharmacare and to dental care, which we've never had. Out of the blue. Socialists need to build on this.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to necessarily happen, but it does mean when we're making our demands, when we're organizing people, when we're campaigning, we can point to, come on, even the New York Times says this, right? And that's an enormous asset. It's an enormous asset. So it's an irony, you're right, Gregory, but it's something that I think will stand us positively. I'd also say, no, sorry, go ahead.